What I'm trying to do here is introduce more and more layers of complexity and nuance so that we can take this stuff, it's like a juggling act, that you have to keep all the balls in the air somehow, right? And that's, if we get nothing else from these weeks that we are spending together, if nothing else comes of this, then at least this, I hope to leave you, right, with this. That whenever we are trying to think environment, right, we are actually thinking about all this other stuff also. So if you came to class thinking, or if you end up going to other classes that are about the environment, thinking, hoping, this is great, I finally don't have to learn about politics. Fantastic, right? I finally don't have to listen to people drone on about, feminism, race, poverty, who cares? I just want to know about nature. I just love nature, guys. Come on, right? I just want to hug some trees and save the world, right? I have bad news for you, of course, right? And this is the point, right? Whenever we are talking about, as we heard last time, if we're interested in the future of drinking water, then we are also interested in the future of shit, right? If we're interested in wilderness, then we are also interested in disability, right? Disabled bodies versus the fully abled, strong wilderness guy. If we're interested in landscape, right? Beautiful, who doesn't like beautiful landscapes? They're so wonderful to look at. If we're interested in landscapes, we are also already thinking about gender. We are also already thinking, as I hope to show you a little bit tonight, about race. Right? So this is the so-called bad news, right, of the course. The unhappy message of the course is that environmental thinking, right, environmental decision-making, if it's good decision-making, will have to involve all of these layers of complexity. It will have to somehow at least acknowledge that there are these things to think about, even if we don't know how to do it yet, right? And that we are missing good frameworks for how to put all of these things together. We need to build them, right? Guess who's going to build them? Who's going to build them? You. You are going to buy. Who else? Right? You guys are going to build them. So I think what I'll do today is I'll talk about the race stuff that I want to introduce to you because I think it'll be interesting to you. But then at the end, I'm going to try to bring in an example from my own life because last time somebody back there cornered me asking me about me, which I was completely unprepared for, right? But if you guys are really this interested in me, I have some stuff to show you. Okay, but first this. I want to introduce you to the work of Carolyn Finney. Most of what I will be talking about today, most of the text that I am projecting is either direct quotes or paraphrases of stuff from her book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. She's an African American geographer, and that's a discipline we haven't quite seen here yet in the texts that we've been working with, geography. And what she's responding to is something that in the United States comes as no surprise, right? So it's sort of it's a commonplace. And we can call it a stereotype, right? But it's also sort of common knowledge that black folks are not interested in the environment. Or to put it a little bit differently, that environmentalism is stuff white people like, right? Do you know this wonderful website, stuffwhitepeoplelike.com? Oh, you're welcome. I just changed your life. Stuffwhitepeoplelike.com. Fantastic. There's a long list of stuff white people like. Can you imagine what's on that list? Any guesses? Drugs? No, well, and antidepressants. White people like those. What else could be on the list?
Some celebrities.
Some celebrities, of course. What else? Coffee is absolutely one of the things at the top of the list. Expensive coffee.
Why?
What?
Why?
Well, I don't know why, but the world loves to pay a lot more for coffee than it needs to. That's what we're all doing, right? So expensive coffees are on the list. Cats, pets in general are on the list. Yeah, think about just sort of like bourgeois ridiculousness, right? It's all on the list. And so is nature. White people love them some nature. Okay? Or I should say, sorry, I don't know that nature is on the list, but I think hiking is on the list, right? Camping is on the list. I have a very good African-American friend back in the US, and whenever I go on vacation, she says, where are you going? And I say, oh, I'm going to California. It's going to be amazing. I'm going camping and hiking, and it's going to be really hard. You know, for 4 days, I'm going to carry everything on my back and hike through the mountains and camp and cook for myself. And she's like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just go to a spa and just get massages for 4 days? She's like, you're just doing some white people shit. Okay? So, all jokes aside, right, we are dealing with a sort of phenomenon, socially speaking, right? And so Finney is trying to make sense of how this happens, why this happens, what's the deal, why is environmentalism a white movement? How did this happen? Okay, so I want to show you some text from the book. The dominant environmental narrative in the United States is primarily constructed and informed by white, Western European, or Euro-American voices. This narrative not only shapes the way the natural environment is represented, constructed, and perceived in our everyday lives, but informs our national identity as well. This will be very important to her. Missing from the narrative is an African-American perspective, a non-essentialized Black environmental identity. This is what she wants. Now I want to talk about this word for a moment, non-essentialized. Right, so we're not going to try to say that there is some true Black experience, right, that there's some singular Black experience that lives inside Black people, right, that every Black person exhibits, right? So that's not what we're trying to do, but we are going to try to talk about something like collective memory, shared experience. We are going to try to talk about something like culture as something shared among people, among a group of people, right? So a non-essentialized Black environmental identity that is grounded in the legacy of African American experiences in the United States, mediated by privilege, right? So there are different kinds of Black people, men and women, richer, poorer, different ages, right? Different sexualities. All of these things matter when we try to talk about a Black identity, right? So there is no one Black identity, but there is something like a Black identity. This is what she's trying to get at. Mediated by privilege, both intellectual and material, influenced by race, gender, class, and other aspects of difference that can determine one's ability to access spaces of power and decision-making. And informed by resistance to and/or acceptance of the dominant narrative. So this Black environmental identity is always in relationship to this dominant environmental narrative. Right? Either in the relationship of resistance, no, we're not like that, it wasn't like that, or the relationship of acceptance and assimilation, right? Yes, we want to be part of this narrative too. Okay? Okay. So here are some things that I've talked about already, right? Previous studies have shown that among different racial and ethnic groups, African Americans are less likely to participate in recreation activities than whites, while economic limitations have been cited as primary reasons, right? Economic limitations, so poverty, right? Lack of money. have been cited as primary reasons why non-white peoples, and in particular Americans, lack enthusiasm for the national parks, for example, right? Others feel that a history of subjugation to the land, and this is what we're going to talk about today, what is meant by that. A history of subjugation to the land and racial prejudice have given rise to general indifference to national park concerns, right? So remember back on that first lecture that we had that was all about the formation of the national park idea, how it came to be, how it was this massive thing for American national identity, right? What I didn't mention at the time was not all Americans, right? And very, very significantly, not all Americans. So that's what we'll talk about today. Along with environmental organizations, environmental participation in outdoor recreation appears to have primarily a white face, right? So it's not only the environmentalists who are white, it's the hikers, the campers, and so on. Studies over the last 20 years that have addressed African American participation, in outdoor, sorry, I screwed up here. So the point is, these are studies from the last 20 years. Here we go. 1985 to 1987 Public Area Recreation Visitor Study, which included the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service, showed that 94% of visitors were white. This is the number I wanted to show you. And 2% were African American. Right? So we're not talking about close numbers here. Right? 94% versus 2%. In particular, African Americans exhibited the lowest rate of participation in backpacking, camping both in developed and primitive areas, wildlife observation and photography, canoeing, and kayaking. Okay, so we're not just talking about a bad stereotype, right? We've got something's happening here, something. So what is it? Wait. But here is the question I want to ask, right? Why would racism give rise to indifference to green spaces? Because it's one thing to say, well, we think that racial prejudice has caused general indifference to the national parks. But why would this be? What does racism have to do with an indifference, right? With not caring about green spaces? Okay. So she writes, American collective identity, particularly in relation to place, to the idea of place, is grounded in the dominant narratives of environment and the great outdoors. Okay? But while all individuals may imbue a landscape with meaning, right? Maybe a landscape means something to everyone, only some meanings gain traction. Okay? Only some meanings. What does it mean to gain traction? Yeah, but what does it literally mean when you gain traction? What's traction? Yes, good. The wheels of a car on the road. It's when the wheels catch the road and so you can drive, right? So that's how you're right. But it means metaphorically to become popular. Only some meanings gain traction in our quest to define ourselves and the places we live, or to shape a national narrative that supposedly reflects the beliefs and experiences of all Americans. In order to have achieved certain goals on the road to become a nation, American identity was also formed by how some people othered particular groups to advance certain tenets of Americanism, including economic freedom and prosperity, right? So it's very interesting that you have, narratives of economic freedom and prosperity at the same time that you are keeping slaves. Right? And this isn't just a sort of weird error, right? These things go together when people are othered, which is a sort of complex process that we haven't spent much time talking about, but I think we're getting a pretty good feeling for. Whether we leave out the removal of American Indians from their land, or the refusal to give ex-slaves their 40 acres and a mule, which I will talk about in a minute, the effort to airbrush the definition of an American collective identity on the national landscape, right, has stymied our ability to fully comprehend who Americans are collectively and individually. This effort to, excuse me, show the national landscape and airbrush this, say that here we are, right, here is America, this is the we that is America, she says, has actually stymied, right, has actually prevented or hurt, injured, right, our ability to actually comprehend who Americans are collectively and individually. Yes?
What is meant by great outdoors?
What is meant by great outdoors? What do you think? Well,
Like this general notion of
this general notion. Remember when we were talking about Thoreau and Muir and that idea that the real American, remember the Marlboro Man, right? He goes to the great outdoors. Timothy Treadwell went to the great outdoors, right? It's this idea that the real, the free person, right? The free person who goes to test himself, who am I really, right? Does it in nature. There's your great outdoors. Okay? So she talks about key sites of nationalistic sentiment, right? These lands, these key sites, were our cathedrals, our representations to the world of, supposedly, the best of who we are and who we can be. From the beginning, African Americans, as well as other non-white peoples, were not allowed to participate on their own terms in this project, right? So what you've got is a kind of narrative imposed on people, right? These representations to the world of the best of who we are and who we can be. That narrative was shaped, right, in a particular way. And it was shaped to privilege, right, and foreground the Euro-American, right, the European American, the white American experience. In the 19th century, which is the era, as you guys remember, of massive westward expansion, the end of the frontier, but also the era of the first massive European migrations to the United States. Right, the big ones on the boats going through Ellis Island and then going to populate the cities, New York City, Chicago, and everything in between. Sorry. I'm going to be drinking a lot. Sorry, got a drinking problem. Okay. But wait. Guys. Really, all this racism, it's not so fun. It's not so good. Maybe we should just be colorblind. Right? I mean, how hard can it be? You just look at all people and you see that they're all just people. They're all the same. Done. Problem solved. Why can't we just be colorblind? Why do you keep seeing race? What's your problem? Nobody knows. That's been my answer for the last 6 weeks. Nobody knows. Yes?
Maybe because people were always living like by this system, and then when we understood that something is wrong, it's not like quite a moment and everything is changed. It's hard to move racism away from culture and our life system.
But why is it so hard? Why can't we just, maybe we should, I mean, come on. I mean, we all know that people are equal. Right? We're good.
Maybe because these people were aliens for so many time.
So it's this, so I think these are related ideas, right? You're saying this is actually, the history matters here, right? And there's a sort of depth and a kind of, what's the word? And the history sucks us back a little bit, right? It holds us back. Yeah, right. I think you guys are giving really good answers, but there's even a problem with sort of saying that we are colorblind, right? And this is what she wants us to see here. Because when we claim to be, when we say things like, Americans are all the same, right? It becomes another way of perpetuating a narrative that privileges the white experience. So when you have a narrative that privileges the experience of a certain group of people, and then you say, you know what, we are actually all the same.
It's just like women are not animals. In the same way, like you say.
It's just, I like this. I haven't thought about this this way, but I like this idea. It's just the same as saying women are not animals. Yeah, I have to work on that, but I like this a lot. I like this, I do. But you see the problem, right? You create a narrative that actually privileges the experience of a group of people, and then you say everyone else is the same. The same as who? Oh, the same as those people, right? So you're still not actually taking diversity seriously. You're still not actually taking experience, right, narrative seriously. Wait, I still have like 15 slides to go. See? All right. I have an answer to this question. Okay, so my answer has to do with, or her answer, our answer has to do with exactly what we've been doing for the past few weeks, right? When we started with Eli Clare saying, why doesn't anybody ask us what our life is like when he's talking about disabled people, right? She's going to say the same thing. Maybe we should talk about what the environmental experience was like for African Americans, because it was a specific kind of environmental experience. Can we get at it from narratives, right? From stories. Remember, when we are talking about a non-dominant group, when we are talking about a minority group, whether it's women, right, or whether it's an ethnic minority, right, or poor folks in the slums, when we are talking about a group like that, it's going to be hard to get a really clear narrative, right? Because the entire time, as you said, they have been othered. So these narratives are sort of underground, or they're strange, right? So there's there hasn't been a kind of massive propaganda campaign, right, like there was with white culture, to say, here we are, the nation, right? So we are talking about culture showing itself to us in different ways, okay? So she says, let's take a look at the relationship of slavery to nature, to the idea of nature. So what was nature at this time, right, of slavery? So first of all, let's talk a little bit about slavery, just to all get on the same page here. Between 1619 and the early 1800s, approximately 400,000 enslaved Africans were brought to the United States to work on plantations, in forests, and on water as fishermen and boat builders. An additional 8 million were made to work the coffee and sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean and the mines of Spanish America. They cultivated land, herded cattle, erected the hydraulic systems of banks, canals, and drains, and planted, tended, harvested, and processed plantation crops throughout the colonies. In addition, they put to use relevant skills and knowledge previously developed in the irrigated rice fields of West Africa, where they're from. Working the land under the threat of the whip and the sun was an integral part of the environmental experience, quote unquote, of enslaved Africans. Through backbreaking labor and general day-to-day interactions, enslaved Africans became more knowledgeable about their surrounding environment than their white slave owners. Right? So if we actually start thinking about slavery as a relationship to the land, rather than just as a sort of economic event, right, or a moral event, we can start getting these kinds of stories out, these kinds of narratives out. But not all environmental interactions were related to work. The knowledge about their environment obtained through work afforded slaves an intimate understanding of the places where they lived, that they used in their hunting, in cultivating their personal gardens, and in the raising of their livestock. Combining ingenuity and necessity while drawing on their cultural heritage as Africans, right, slaves devised numerous methods for successfully catching animals and fish to supplement their meager diets. So because they were working, right, in the fields, because they were working in the land, they actually understood it much better, right? They had to understand it much better. Their survival depended on it. Their diets depended on it. Animals and plants culled from woods and waterways were also used by individuals to increase their power within the slave community and between master and slave. This is an interesting point. In particular, the wild environment was a source of power for female slaves who were knowledgeable about roots and herbs for medicinal purposes, right? So suddenly, right, these people, these women specifically, but these people had a knowledge. They could do something, right, which was even a source of power between slave and master. Maybe someone had an infection or something, right, that the slave could then cure just using herbs. That's a power, right? Cultivating and foraging plants was also a form of resistance. I like this. This is a very abstract point. A way for slaves to regain and maintain ownership over their bodies and how they cared for them. So all of that sort of holistic stuff, right, with plants and medicine, that it was a way to be in relationship with one's body under conditions of incredibly strained, stressful, horrific embodiment, right? Very difficult embodied conditions, slavery. Okay. So we're getting the sense of something like a collective memory here, right? Something like talking about shared experiences in the past that then build an identity, right, of a people, an identity in relationship to the outdoors or to natural things, right, to nature. And she writes, the woods induced both positive and negative feelings. So the woods were a place that was resource rich, as we saw, a place of transformation and refuge. Forests were often used for religious services, marriages, right, which were illegal, right? Slaves could not marry. They would have secret marriages, right, in the woods. So a lot of what had to happen out of sight would happen in the woods, like religious services, marriages, and so on, right? But also a lot of punishment happened in the woods. So the woods were a place to fear. And slaves were often told, you know, if you disobey, right, you will be taken to the woods and things will happen to you there, right? So many forms of sort of physical punishment took place in the woods also. So it was this place where things happened that were sort of out of sight, right? Now, many runaway slaves used the woods to hide, sometimes only for a brief respite from slave life or as a permanent refuge. So you could go to the woods and have a secret moment, have a private moment, right? Slaves didn't have privacy. There was no such thing. They weren't humans, right, under the law. So you could have this private moment, right? Or if you were on the run, you were hiding in the woods, right? Still for others, the forest marked the beginning of their journey to freedom. For example, the Great Dismal Swamp, which I'll talk about at length, a wetland expanse covering 600 square miles in Virginia and North Carolina, became home for hundreds of runaway slaves, which were called Maroons. This is the technical name, right, for the runaway slave, in the early 19th century. Despite the difficulty of navigating this kind of terrain, runaway slaves shared their knowledge of this environment with each other to build a life apart from the watchful gaze of their white owners while successfully avoiding capture. So we are talking about a massive expanse of land, right, which is a swamp where they ran away to and hid. I want to show you some pictures of Great Dismal Swamp. Great Dismal Swamp is now a national wildlife refuge. It is administered by the National Park Service. It's in Virginia and North Carolina. You can visit it. It's another picture of Great Dismal Swamp. You can see how high the water is. Sorry? They would build houses up high. I mean, they didn't probably live here, but there were sort of, you can see that there are sort of pieces of land. Huts up high, yeah. Okay. So much for slavery, right? Slavery as a particular relationship to the land. What about after slavery? Right? Because slavery was abolished, we could say, a long time ago. So what's happened since then? So she writes a lot about the relationship between conservation and eugenics. You guys know this word, eugenics? What does it mean? What's eugenics?
Some kind of ideology.
Some kind of ideology, right? So it's a group of practices, but what's the ideology? You can produce goddess people. You can produce, yes, this idea that you can sort of produce genetically superior and more genetically superior specimens of people. Yeah, I don't know. I think people say it started back with Plato, right? So Plato talks about being able to generate, that if you breed the right people, right, you can sort of generate a master race. So I think the Nazis are coming late in the game. But this talk of Nazis is not for nothing, right? Because Nazis were fantastic conservationists. Right? In fact, the reason that we still have the European bison around, right? That was in large part a Nazi conservation effort. Why? Well, because the master race needs a beautiful landscape in which to live, and that beautiful landscape should be full of beautiful, properly European animals, right? All the right animals. European bison was a beautiful sort of symbol, right, of the future for them. So conservation and eugenics has a kind of sticky history. Right? We could even say environmentalism and eugenics has a bit of a sticky history. Right? Think about, when we talk about examples of eugenics, things like forced sterilization, right, of disabled people is a great example of this. Forced sterilization of poor people, which is going on right now. Forced sterilization of to put it strongly, right? Forced sterilization of black people. In animals, we could think about it going the other way, right? Artificial insemination of animals in order to preserve certain traits, right, that we think we can't get rid of, or keeping them separated from each other so that they don't crossbreed, so that we don't lose these good, like I think the European bison is a problematic animal because cows, like normal farm cows, can breed with it. And you don't want your, honorable European bison, making babies with your common farm cow, right? So keeping animals separated from each other so that they don't interbreed. Keeping the genetic line pure is something that goes on in conservation all the time. So she talks about this history, right? And then sort of some of you I'm sure know about this from some of your other classes, the links between blackness and primitivism. I only put up sort of the two most famous cases of this. The most famous one was Sandra, she was called Sandra Bartman, right? The Hottentot Venus, who was exhibited in the nude, prodded, painted, and publicly debased in London between 1810 and 1815, and after her death, right? After her death, they cut out her brain and they cut out her vagina, and they put them in jars on display in the museum, right? That's how much of a, because she was an African woman, right? And the shape of her body was considered to be indicative of her sexual looseness, right? And so she was a cultural and scientific phenomenon for people to look at, right? Even after she died. And she died at age 25. The other, and this was a long time ago, so this is, she has nothing to do with with the American slavery situation. She actually went straight from Africa to London. So in the US, much later, we've got the case of Ota Benga, who was a 23-year-old bushman from the Congo, living as a slave when he was discovered by a guy, an entrepreneur who'd been commissioned to bring back pygmies to the United States. Benga became a traveling exhibit for 2 years. In 1906, he was brought to the Museum of Natural History and became an ethnographic display. Then he was sold to the Bronx Zoo, and he was housed in the primate exhibit, which promoted him as the evolutionary missing link, right? So these are just 2 examples of a massive history of this. And this was exactly around the same period when environmentalism was born. We are talking about the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, right? That is when you've got traveling exhibits. That's when you have circuses, right? When you've got the bearded lady at the circus, when you've got the freaks, when you have the conjoined twins who are put on display and traveling around the world, right? So she writes, for an Anglo-American population fearful of the massive influx of immigrants and struggling to control a large free black population, right, after emancipation, the spectacle of a man living in the same cage with an orangutan offered tangible reassurance, right? Tangible reassurance that some people are better than other people. What a relief, right? So we're talking about relationships to the land, right? And we're talking about imaginaries, social imaginaries of nature, right? Of what nature is, what it means to be human, who counts as human, all the stuff that you guys have heard me yell about for the last 6 weeks. Right? We're talking about this exactly. And that's not all. Now back to the land question. I said I would say a little bit about 40 acres and a mule. So this is the name of a policy that was promised to slaves during the Civil War, right? So as the nation is fighting, right, for sort of control of the nation, and it's clear that once the war is over, slaves will be freed, right? The question is, what happens then, right? All these people are freed, and then what? So the people making this decision decided to do something really radical, which is to ask the black people themselves, what do you want? What do you want once you're free, right? And their answer was land. We want land. And this is the only way that we are going to be able to sort of come out of this terrible hole that we are in, right? We want land. So they were promised, every slave was promised 40 acres of land. The mule came later. It was supposed to be lent to them by the US Army. And Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time, made them this promise, right? we talk about sometimes how completely differently American history would have gone had this actually happened. Like what a completely different world we would be living in, right? Had 40 acres and a mule actually happened. It did not happen. The guy who became president right after Lincoln immediately rescinded the promise, and the land was given back to its original plantation owners, right? Who were no longer keeping plantations on it, but it was 400,000 acres of land that was then given back, right? So 40 acres and a mule, which was this promise of land that didn't happen. And finally, lynchings. So, she writes, a tree became a painful symbol for many black people, reminding them that the color of their skin could mean death by hanging. Between 1882 and 1968, approximately 4,742 black people were lynched illegally by white mobs. Okay? This is long after the abolition. We're talking about after the abolition of slavery, right? So lynching as a practice is not a slavery practice. I want this to be clear. It's post-slavery. Approximately the same number of people, so one more time, this number, were either legally lynched based on court decisions, fell victims to private white violence, or were murdered by a variety of means in isolated rural sections and dumped in rivers and creeks. Right, so this is really important. Whenever we talk about lynching, we always think of hanging. But many lynchings weren't hangings. They were murders, right, that were happening in wild places, right? They were happening out in the country, out, by the creek somewhere, in the woods, right? One of the most famous in 1955 was the murder of Emmett Till. Does this name mean anything to you guys here? No, nothing. He became a sort of icon of the civil rights movement, right? And we always talk about the lynching of Emmett Till, and people don't usually know he wasn't hung at all. Hung, hanged, hung, hanged, hanged, hang, hung. Wait, what? He wasn't. Americans in the audience, Zach, hanged. He wasn't hanged. Okay, thank you. Right. He was a 14-year-old boy who was kidnapped from his house by two adult white men, right? Kidnapped from his house, beaten, mutilated, shot, and then thrown in the river. His body came up 3 days later, right, in the river, and then there was an open casket funeral. So it was this quite intense and dramatic kind of event that really pointed to the land, right? It said, look, this is happening here. It's not some idea, it's not some abstraction, right? So one way to think about this is, yeah, racial segregation is not just an idea or an economic fact, it's a geographical fact, right? She points out lynching was primarily designed, this terrorism by white people on black people was designed to curtail the freedom of movement and occupation that African Americans had begun to enjoy. It was to show them, you can't go everywhere. You can't go where you think you can go, right? So she says, lynching succeeded in limiting the environmental imagination of black people. If you have enough things like this, right? If you have enough factors like this, what you will get, right, is a population that has a very ambivalent relationship to nature. Okay. How are we doing, guys? Everyone looks really happy. Big smiles, big smiles. Can I answer any questions about? I can move on in a minute, right? But do you guys have questions about this? And anything that I can? I'm not an expert in the history of slavery or anything like that, but I can try to answer some stuff. I bet you do. But I don't blame you. That's the kind of information that usually shuts people up. It's what I call a party killer, you know, really, really terrible. Okay, so here are the things that she proposes. Given all of this, she says, look, maybe for African Americans, creating a deep-seated sense of feeling and responsibility regarding the environment may not come primarily from telling them that they need to save the trees for their children's future. Maybe this isn't the right story, right? She says, African Americans are continually using the past as a way to represent themselves and say, we were there and we are here now. Why should it be any different when talking about the environment? Specifically for African Americans, memory, both collective and individual, provides a way to name and recreate a place, which gives or reaffirms excuse me, the power to recreate ourselves and the places we live in. This allows us to construct environmental spaces in our own image. She says, so maybe from the African American perspective, what's really important is the past, right? What's really important is the past rather than the future. You think about how wilderness is constructed. It's this place that's kind of out of time, right? Wilderness is like pure now. Off you go into the wilderness and you're, you know, it's pure now. And then what have you got after the now? You've got the future, right? Look at this perfect place that's out of politics, out of history, out of time. It's not a social place. It's purely natural. Save it for your children. Done. Right? She's saying, for African Americans, a completely different way of thinking about land is necessary. If what you want is to make people feel responsible for the land, right? Responsible to take care of the land. And then she says, there needs to be recognition by environmental institutions that memory and personal experience for many African Americans far outweigh the distant statistics that do not reflect their lives. While I'm not suggesting discarding statistics in favor of anecdotes when making policy decisions, I do advocate for inclusion of personal stories in any decision-making process that is truly interested in diversity. So she says, you know, we can't throw away the numbers and only have stories. But we need to also have stories. The numbers themselves, right, the statistics themselves are not going to be enough for decision making and policy creation, environmental policy creation. We need stories. We need the story of relationship to the land. Otherwise, there's no reason to do anything. Right? And this is one reason, guys, that you guys have to study literature. Okay? I hate to break it to you, it's true. I know you were hoping to never have to read another novel again. You could just throw yourselves into environmental work and that would be it. But in fact, right, so much of how a people, right, how a social group relates to land or is from someplace, right, is reflected in its literature. So, yeah, this is why you guys have to take literature and nature. This is why you have to take great books literature, right? And why you have to listen to the stories of indigenous people, right? Not just because you're nice. Like, yes, I'm nice. I'm going to listen to the indigenous people too. Okay. No, right? It's because it actually matters for the work that you want to do as environmentalists. Okay? Yes?
I'm not sure I understand. Can there be any example, like a way to name and recreate a place, or is it more generalized?
Sorry, asking that again.
So can there be any example of how they name and recreate a place? So is it more generalized idea?
I was hoping you would ask that. Thank you. I'll give you the money later that we talked about. Yeah, because look at this. Wait, no. Okay, back to remember the Great Dismal Swamp? So she gives us an example of sort of how to think about the Great Dismal Swamp differently, right? Here's her story of Great Dismal Swamp. Between 1720 and 1860, thousands of Maroons lived on high ground in cabins or shacks, grew their own food, and hunted. Maroons built a life for themselves, and in some cases, they were raising children who had never seen the face of a white person. Remember that this is during slavery, right? So this is quite extraordinary what's happening here. But the terrain was hazardous and at times impenetrable. Black people building a life in the swamp were also living under the continuous fear of being discovered. Disgruntled slave owners organized drives, inviting hunters to bring so-called Negro dogs, who were specifically trained to track down people hiding out in the swamp. Okay? Yet, the wilderness, as defined in contemporary terms, became a place of refuge and possibility for Black people. One might even go so far as to label parts of the Great Dismal Swamp during this historical period as a Black landscape. A system of paths, places, and rhythms that a community of enslaved people created as an alternative, often as a refuge, to the landscape system of planters and other whites, right? An alternative to the white landscape, the landscape systems of planters and other whites. We are offered an opportunity to expand how we view resistance and resilience in their multiple manifest forms on the landscape. Right? So keep that in mind, a system of paths, places, and rhythms that a community of enslaved people created as an alternative. So looking at this as a national wildlife refuge is one thing. Looking at it as a place with that history is slightly different. Right? Because we're talking about a very specific thing that happened in this very specific place because it is this kind of place. Because it's a hazardous place that's difficult to navigate. Right? So it becomes a place of refuge. It's also very difficult to navigate, right? It's also scary. Right? But the idea of looking at this as a black landscape, or that there would be such things as Black landscapes if we tell the stories differently. Right? Okay, hold on, where am I? Here. So, she has this wonderful quote that she's taken from somebody else. I didn't look up who this was, but I have it here for you if you want to. And along the way, they left stories in the ground. Right? They left stories in the ground, that the ground is a place of stories. Right? And any responsible environmentalism needs to take that into account, that the ground is a place of stories. Okay, so let me just drink some water. How are you guys doing? But wait, that's not all. So we have our example, right, of such a story with the Great Dismal Swamp. So she has given us some idea of how to think about a Black environmentalism differently, or maybe we should just think about environmentalism differently, right? She isn't just saying this is only the case for Black people. Maybe there's something missing, right, from the white environmental fantasy that needs to be filled out a little bit better. But there's one more thing. So she's very critical of this thing that happens in American environmental discourse, and the thing is called environmental justice. And I want to tell you guys what that means. It's a movement, right? It's a movement to talk about environmental events in terms of social classes, right? Or social classes in terms of environmental events. A little bit like what we did last time. A little bit related to what we did last time, okay? So to understand environmental justice, we have to understand environmental discrimination. It's exactly what we talked about last time, right? Except this time we're talking about race and not economic class. A disproportionate quantity of landfills, incinerators, factories, and other potentially toxic facilities are built inside or close to minority communities. Right? This can be seen as environmental discrimination because it is placing a harmful entity in a place where people often don't have the means to fight back against big corporations. So it's just sort of being done to them. The location of transportation infrastructures, including highways, ports, and airports, has also been viewed as a source of environmental injustice. Right? So usually when we're talking about environmental justice, what we're actually talking about is we are protesting environmental injustice, right? And calling for environmental justice. And it's things like, you know, you're living someplace and suddenly they build an airport there, right? Which has all kinds of terrible things connected to it, not the least of which is noise. Your friend, noise, right? Not your friend. Among the earliest documentation of environmental racism was a study of the distribution of toxic waste sites across the United States. Toxic waste. Due to the results of that study, right, what was found, where these toxic waste sites were, waste dumps and waste incinerators have been the target of environmental justice lawsuits and protests. Poor people account for more than 20% of the human health impacts from industrial toxic air releases, compared to 12.9% of the population of the United States nationwide, right? So poor people account for 20% compared to 12.9% of the population. But this difference does not account for the inequity found among individual minority groups. And this is where EJ, we call it, environmental justice, right, comes in and points out things like this, right? African Americans are exposed to more carcinogens than whites because of where they live. Latinos have disproportionately high exposure to pesticides. Those who are undocumented cannot formally complain against companies, right? All the Latinos who come into the United States to work the fields, that is their primary industry, and they are dying, right, from exposure to pesticides, or they are sick. Native Americans are more exposed to hazards from mining, like unclean water, because of where they live and because of legal loopholes that undermine their protections, right? So, because Native Americans live on trust land, reservation land, right? But that land that isn't subject, it's not quite, it's not administered by the United States government in the same way, right? Because of the sort of the political situation with Native Americans, right? So they have some degree of autonomy, and for that reason, the same environmental protections don't always apply to the land on which they live, right? So when something really bad is happening, the people doing it can say, well, I didn't break any law, right? There was no law protecting this land from mining or fracking or whatever, right? So you're getting a little bit of an idea, right, of environmental justice. And it's mostly this idea that claims, you know, when we talk about the coming disaster, right, the big one, it's coming, the coming disaster that's going to change everything, right? This idea that environmental disaster is the great equalizer is, of course, wrong. It does exactly the opposite, right? It exacerbates differences. Or that the planet is ours to share, guys. Let's all put our hands together and make a long circle of people that will go around the planet, right? It obscures these massive structural inequalities. So that's the idea of environmental justice. Now, Finney says, the problem is, whenever we talk about African Americans and environment, we only ever talk about environmental justice. Right? We never just talk about, I don't know, maybe there's some other way to think about African Americans and environment rather than just this framework, right? So she says, one of the biggest challenges for individuals whose work is considered environmental is how quickly anything related to African Americans and the environment gets designated as an environmental justice concern right away. There is usually no discussion about the particulars. Just the mere fact that race, this tells you how white environmentalism is, by the way. Right? Just the mere fact that race or black people are involved usually relegates African American environmental interactions, or fill in the blank here, Latino, any Native American, any kind of minority, right? Environmental interaction to a particular point on the environment spectrum, and that point is environmental justice always. Right? So, as you know, I organize a conference. This is going to be cut out of the video, by the way, because I'm going to get into so much trouble for saying this. You guys know I organize a conference in the United States, right? The International Association for Environmental Philosophy. Well, when we get proposals for people who want to present, we sift through them and we see whose proposal do we want to accept, whose proposal will we reject, and then we make the program based on what we have. And then it'll be like, someone will be looking at, let's put these papers together. Look, here's 3 papers. There's one here about Mexican Americans. There's one here about African Americans and another one about, I don't know, maybe like autism or something. Let's put them all together and make it an environmental justice panel. Right? There's never even any possibility that we could think about minority identity, minority stories in relationship to the environment in any way that isn't environmental justice. Okay, that was completely off the cut. Okay, perfect. All right, we're back. You guys look so good. Look at you guys, amazing. All right, she says, of course, there's nothing wrong with environmental justice. Like, we should be looking at the fact that African Americans are more exposed to carcinogens, right? But is this the best framework to understand any environmental issues or experience had by African Americans? Is environmental justice the best way to frame Black environmental experience? Is it the only way? What are some of the limitations of always using this framework, right? And I love this question. What kinds of questions are we not asking as a result of always using environmental justice to talk about African Americans and the environment, or to talk about whomever, right? So I really like this question, and I pulled it aside for you because I want us to hold on to it for the future. What kinds of questions are we not asking as a result of always using some framework? Right? Even the ecofeminist, my beloved ecofeminist framework, you guys remember? We have to ask ourselves that question there. What kinds of questions are we not asking as a result of always using an ecofeminist framework? Because there always are some. There always are some. So for me, the lesson here is these 2 things that I have put for you in red. This one, wait, where is it? And along the way, they left stories in the ground, which I think is really powerful and important to say. And then, what kinds of questions are we not asking as a result of always using blank? It's a way to get us back to what happened in class last time, right? When we talk about natural disasters just in terms of nature, what kinds of questions are we not asking? When we talk about natural disasters only in terms of economics and infrastructure, what kinds of questions are we not asking? Right? So we need to keep inviting that complexity back. If it's there, right, we need to keep inviting it back rather than trying to simplify. That's the idea.